Redemption is one of my favourite tropes in storytelling, for it representing the idea that even the worst of us can change their ways, if putting the effort in, with some of those that I would consider to be amongst the best fictional characters owing it, at least partially, to their gradual redemption arcs. Sometimes, though, it benefits to go against this, and show the improbability of actually changing core parts of one's personality. This does come with its own risk if this arc is one of dynamic changes back and forward, as it increases the likelihood of bad character regression or inconsistency, with it being important to see how to avoid this. Let's look at Game of Thrones as a punching bag, example. Jaime Lannister was amongst the best characters in the series, and fairly engaging even after the show stopped following the book plot, even if he got dragged into stupid plot lines, with his conflict between his feelings for Cersei and the desire to do what he believes is right. Though not as well written or complex as what George R.R. Martin wrote, obviously, I can appreciate Show Jaime having more back and forth than his book self at times, with him taking significantly longer to separate himself from her will, despite the atrocious acts she commits. Even if I'd say it'd make far more sense for his character to have abandoned her at the end of Season 6. As Finn seemed to have set up the character growth of him freeing himself completely of Cersei and finding a more pure love with Brienne, however, Jaime undoes all this by going back to Cersei and taking his character consistency with him. Leaving aside the consistency issues, someone with less clarity on the arc may say it shows the struggle of truly moving on from your previous self. But this isn't really the case, as the prior episodes of Season 8 do nothing to highlight a conflict in Jaime's feelings, with him seeming entirely at peace with the decision before this heel turn, because Benioff and Weiss think subverting expectations is more important than a coherent character arc. This is doubly egregious with the seeds planted for his return to Cersei, making sense if he were to protect the innocent child she was carrying from what was to come, in the parallel of his kinslayer decision to destroy his reputation to save citizens innocent of the actions of war. But this wasn't done despite being right there, with the pregnancy plot point ultimately being a filler line. It also doesn't help with how hollow the events after this decision are, with him having an arbitrary fight with Euron and choosing to die together with Cersei when standing somewhere pretty clear of rubble. It's with this that Jaime joined the cavalcade of character assassinations that converged in Season 8. Now, to focus on another HBO series, we'll go into how this type of character arc can be done excellently. Despite my channel mainly covering things to do with Dragon Ball, Buffy, and a few others, it's The Sopranos that I crown as the best television series of all time, and quite possibly best work of fiction. From its highly complex characters, psychological look at the mafia archetype, or the layers of meaning placed into even the most minor of choices, it's difficult for any series to match one of its strengths, let alone the full package. One point of greatness worth bringing up for this comparison is in the character arc of Christopher Moltisanti. Actually, where's this arc?
Where's my arc, Paulie?
We'll come back to that later. One of The Sopranos' greatest accomplishments with its characters is what can be compared to some classical tragedies, or for a slightly more modern example, how those in something such as Neon Genesis Evangelion are handled, with the arcs of its characters being an antithesis of the traditional character arc, in a true display of the art imitates life mantra, in showing how unlikely it is for people to truly change core aspects of their character through either their personality flaws or circumstances surrounding them. If oversimplifying Chris's journey, it would be that of one ambitious to become something greater in both the mob and as an aspiring screenwriter, but being held back in both by narcotic addictions that ultimately become his downfall. What helps make his character so well written, though, is both the back and forth between progression and regression from the situations around him, and how the reactions of those around him prevent him from moving on to a better life, in in an inevitable tragedy. The latter point is worth pointing out first, as a lot of Christopher's major decisions come about from how he perceives himself, in comparison to those around him, and how he believes they see him. The most obvious example of this is in Season 6, when Paulie's jokes and the reaction of those around him spirals into Chris going back to his addictive habits, and ending any film career he had along with JT's life. On one hand, Christopher's reaction was an extreme one of paranoia, in him reading too much into the situation, through his takeaway that his peers and superiors didn't value him. But it is understandable when nobody was willing to step in and say the jokes about him and his daughter were going too far, especially when supported by the same man who said this.
Look, when it comes to daughters, all bets are off.
This not only shows the series' main themes of hypocrisy within the Mafia, but how certain social codes of this leave people with no options for personal growth, as Tony or someone else breaking up what would be a fun time for most there could be seen as having too much leniency when it comes to Chris. Another instance of this is in his near-death experience, and how he doesn't progress from this entirely. Though his descent into what he believed to be hell causes him to reflect on his fate and add conflict to later decisions, his lifestyle traps him, as does the advice of those around him, such as Paulie's argument on why it was purgatory, which caused him to avoid making any major strides in self-improvement. His two spiked back and forths of conflict throughout his story come from his addiction and how he relates to Tony, along with how they intertwine. Chris's addictions tend to increase in times when he believes Tony is undermining his value, through either favouring others such as Tony Blundetto or Bobby, or at times his efforts seem to be undervalued in general. There is of course his relapse in Season 6 due to the remarks by his friends about his sobriety, but also the broader aspect of being surrounded by people seeking escapism through outlets, just as he abuses substances for such, with Janice's attempts of trying different religions as a source of peace, or Tony's eating habits. The trappings of Chris's addiction also ties into the series' exploration of nature versus nurture, in the addictive personalities in his family, such as his father's substance issues, his mother and great-uncle's alcoholism, as well as his cousin's gambling, which, as Dr. Melfi may say, gave him predispositions even if not doomed him to his path. In the world of the Mafia, though, the importance placed on blood dooms those such as Tony or Chris into thinking their downfall is an inevitability, and, therefore, has them fulfill it. Perhaps the most important case of Christopher's conflict and inability to move on to something better is with Adriana, and choosing loyalty to Tony over a chance to leave with her for new life. In the end, though, this was inevitable, due to the circumstances surrounding them. Chris's need for a son to carry on the family name that he places value on due to his father's accomplishments is made uncertain when learning Adriana may not be able to bear children, along with recent rumours surrounding her, making Chris's desire to make Adriana the most important part of his life impossible, as does the necessity in becoming an informant if so, when he had already gone as far as to help Tony end the life of one. On top of that, there is also Chris's aversion to the regularness of life, which would leave him directionless not only if siding with Adriana here, but also if he were to retire from the regular mob life like Little Carmine did, after his film career took off later on. Thus, it's through his predispositions, lack of positive support from those around him, with one exception, and the contradictory scenario of his respect for Tony, that Christopher is trapped into scenarios that destroy the progress he made, and lead to his downfall when Tony realizes the liability he's become, as his arc becomes a circle, allowing Christopher Moltisanti to stand as a prime example of a classic tragic character in modern media, through his pitiful and sympathetic aspirations being undone by the circumstances of his life, and his inability to move beyond them. If answering what separates these two beyond the general writing quality, the short answer would be that regression upon the progress a character has made needs to be for more than shock value or familiarity, and brought about by circumstances consistent with their life and personality, and for the conflict drawn them from one side to the other being ever present. Thank you for watching until this point. If interested in another aspect that Game of Thrones failed in, you may be interested in this comparison to Buffy the Vampire Slayer in handling character resurrections. As for future Sopranos content, I may do more if there's enough demand, so subscribing to see and leaving a comment would certainly be appreciated.